Hello, and welcome to this episode of EPRI Current. I'm your host, Bill Florence, and today we've got a great episode all about industrial clusters. We're joined today by two very distinguished guests. First, Dr. Sean Bushart. He's an EPRI-funded World Economic Forum Project Fellow working to develop and execute a global initiative for accelerating the transition of industrial clusters to net zero. His previous role was Director of the Environmental Sciences and Technology team in EPRI's generation sector. Jonathan Oxley is joining us today from the UK. He's a chemist by training, and he is the Humber Cluster Director for the Confederation of British Industry, a board trustee for the Royal Society of Chemistry, and a former senior director for the World Energy Council. Sean, let's begin with you, and just so we're level set a little bit, tell us, what are industrial clusters?
Thanks, Bill. I'm really looking forward to this conversation here. Industrial clusters, by concept, aren't new in themselves. Industrial clusters have been around for probably over 100 years. And you could think of it as a regional co-location of businesses and industries for providing economic benefits to the region, for example. But this is a new take in terms of deploying these industrial clusters for the purpose of decarbonization, for the purpose of jointly meeting regional and corporate low carbon goals. This is something that is kind of we're at the forefront of right now. I think a large majority of corporate entities out there have put out net zero goals or decarbonization goals, but it's a hard challenge, especially when you think about industry. Industry is hard to abate, especially when you get into steel, cement, chemicals, for example. And thinking about the technologies that you can put into play is one aspect of this. Thinking about carbon capture, thinking about clean hydrogen, thinking about clean electricity. But the question becomes an economic one in terms of how do you deploy that at scale? And clusters can really help with that. Because they can really leverage not only the regional economics and policy, but also other industries in the region who may be interested in sharing in common infrastructure, which is where the majority of the costs are. So that's kind of a high-level overview. And I'm going to turn over to Jonathan because he is going to be able to kind of give you an illustrative example at Humber in terms of what this cluster concept is and how it works there.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and also very delighted to be here taking part in this podcast today. I think you nailed it there, Sean. If you rewind the clock by about 250 years into the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, we first saw industrial clusters emerging around things like a source of fast-running water to power mills, to make cotton and materials. And then we saw the expansion of trade so that businesses started to cluster around ports. And then businesses started to cluster around a source of coal, for example, to power steam engines. And now, of course, more recently, during the last 50 to 100 years, we've seen businesses cluster around things like sources of hydrocarbons. And you see that in the US, around the Houston Basin, of course. And you see it over here in the UK with sources of energy that come in from the North Sea Basin to the east coast of the UK in particular. And one of those areas is the Humber Estuary. It's located about halfway up the coast of the British Isles, approximately on the east side, where we have a great trading port that actually started life. I think the first commercial trade out of the ports in the Humber Estuary was something like 1743. And there's basically an industrial and commercial history that extends from, way back probably before then. But let's, for the sake of argument, draw the line at somewhere like 250, nearly 300 years before. And so what we see is a huge conglomeration of different manufacturers and industries that are either using things like the sources of energy, or they're using the port and trading infrastructure to transport their goods, or indeed they're using the products of one organization or entity or site as a feedstock for their own production. So you're right, we've got a cluster here in the Humber in the UK that's around about 75 to 80 kilometers long, and about 25 to 30 kilometers in terms of sort of north to south sweep across the Humber Estuary. And we've got businesses that range from steel production to petrochemicals to two of the last refineries in the UK, We've got a biomass power station. We've got chemicals producers, chemical suppliers, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of industry in a cluster, whether that's in the Humber, whether it's in Houston, whether it's in parts of Germany, France, et cetera, et cetera.
I think one of the sort of important sort of factors to call out about Humber or that cluster is that it is the largest CO2 emitting cluster in the UK. So there's a lot of industry going on there. There's a lot of opportunity to work and trying to decarbonize that area, isn't there?
That's absolutely right, Bill. So the Humber, I mean, it depends where the UK's overall economy is and what our sort of manufacturing output looks like. But we here in the Humber, just from the energy intensive industry and associated power production, we account for something like about 7% of the UK's total CO2 emissions. And that's without taking into account any of the transport, domestic, agriculture, anything like that. So of course, because the UK has its net zero target of 2050, and we have our own sort of regional target here in the Humber that equates to about 7% of the UK's CO2 emissions, that's quite a big prize to go at if you want to get the UK to net zero.
Hey, Sean, I mean, so with industrial clusters, I mean, so we, as Jonathan and y'all have discussed, I mean, so these are things that sort of sprang up organically around, so, from one industry that led to another, and this sort of thing. But I mean, in order to address and to reach decarbonization goals, there needs to be some sort of structure in place, doesn't there, for these clusters?
Let me kind of give a little bit of an example, especially, given this audience is largely technology focused, we tend to forget about the big picture and kind of the ecosystem that's really needed to make this happen. So just take one example. Think about steel, for example. So Jonathan mentioned there's steel in the cluster there. So globally, if you're going to decarbonize the steel industry by 2050, it's going to cost you about $300 billion to get there. Just in terms of the capital equipment costs and such, that's a significant investment. But the bigger investment by order of magnitude, almost $3 trillion, is the infrastructure that's needed to make that happen. So by infrastructure, what we mean is you're going to need clean hydrogen, you're going to need clean electricity, you're going to need carbon capture to be able to facilitate whatever the technology deployment opportunities are for the steel that are being deployed at scale at the industrial side itself. So that is where the opportunity is for clusters, and that you can jointly invest in that common infrastructure. Because if you think about clean hydrogen or CCS, for example, there's other industrial partners in the region that are very interested in that. And what it comes right down to is it there a pipeline, for example, for CO2? Is there a common clean electricity infrastructure, transmission and distribution infrastructure? Is there a hydrogen pipeline? So those are the things that become important and that you start to build your infrastructure around at the cluster level. So I'll pass over to Jonathan again to kind of, he can really go into some detail in terms of how that's working at Humbers.
Sure, yeah, and you're right, Sean. So what we're talking about really is in many different ways. We're talking about economies of scale, really. So whether that's economies of scale in terms of the CO2 and the industrial output that needs to be decarbonized, or whether we're talking about the economies of scale that lead to the underpinning infrastructure that will allow that to take place, or whether we're talking about actually even, the engineers, technicians, and so on and so forth, who can actually bring about and install the decarbonization equipment and operate it. So it's this sort of vast, almost labyrinthine kind of collection of economies of scale that underpin industrial clusters like this. And just to go back at one level to your earlier comment, one of your earlier comments, Sean, you talked about the difficulties of decarbonizing, and you're right, it's not straightforward to decarbonize industry. But if you're going to decarbonize industries like these anywhere, your best chance is to do that in an industrial cluster, because you've got those economies of scale to collect and sequester and store the CO2, but you've also got the sort of skills in the clusters that can bring this about, actually. And you see that in a region like the Humber. We've got 6 big clusters in the UK. We've got the Scottish cluster in the northwest. We've got Teesside, South Wales, the Solent, and the Humber, which is the largest industrial cluster, as we've just talked about. And what you see here actually are unique collections of, or partnerships rather, I should say, of industry and companies coming together and going, well, look, we can't afford to, and we don't have the ability to decarbonize our operation in isolation and install our own dedicated pipeline that takes this out to, a former gas reservoir or a saline aquifer to store it. But if we work collectively with you and company X and company Y, then actually we start to generate again a sense of economies of scale that can make this happen here. And governments, in this whole space, I was asked about 2 or 3 months ago, is the future of net zero and decarbonized business, is it state-led or is it private sector-led? And the answer actually is something like it's state-led, private sector delivered, but it's a public-private cooperation to make this happen. It cannot happen without the state setting some of the sort of facets of operation to decarbonize, the rules, if you like, the rules of the game. But you need the players to come on pitch, and those players have to come from the private sector who have the operations that are in need of decarbonization, also have the skills and very often have the finances to be able to help deliver this, certainly access to those finances.
So while an industrial cluster may have grown or developed organically, this getting to a state of like trying to decarbonize that cluster is something that requires, as you're talking, reaching out to different partners. So I mean, collaboration seems to be a key element then in trying to pull everyone together.
You're absolutely right, Bill. Collaboration is key. I mean, it's one of these quite hackneyed words that gets thrown around an awful lot in this space, and it almost starts to lose its power or its effect of meaning after a while. I like to say that if the companies involved in these sorts of collaborations, there we go again, are not collaborating so hard that they're constantly having to check whether they're in breach of competition law, then they're probably not collaborating hard enough, quite frankly, to bring this about. That's the level of sort of collaboration and emphasis and power or whatever you want to put behind this that we need to bring to the table here to make this happen. It's not easy. But the companies that we're talking about in these clusters have just the right sort of skill sets and abilities to deliver this.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think Jonathan held that. I think thinking about the partnership, it's going to be different in every region, which is really what brings the power of that regional collaboration. So you're going to have a different set of industries. You may have, in some cases, you may have a port type influence. In some cases, you may have more of a clean electricity type of focus. And then kind of putting that together with that public-private partnership, because it's not enough just to have the industries together around the table thinking through this. You really have to have the right regional policy enablers, as Jonathan mentioned, to make this happen. And that could be incentives. It could be infrastructure policy enablers. It could be permitting type of enablers to make this happen, because these are unique technologies that are coming into the ground, and also unique infrastructure that's coming to play as well. So very important in terms of this partnering aspects.
And if we look at a cluster like the Humber, some of the work that I led a little while ago, funded by the UK government through EPRI, we demonstrated it would take somewhere between about 15 and 30 billion pounds to decarbonise an industrial cluster like the Humber. So that's roughly $20 billion to $40 billion. And the reason for that sort of factor of 2 in there is really all about the speed at which you move forward with decarbonisation. But the funny thing is, there was never a question mark from the private sector around finding or accessing the funds to invest in those sorts of projects to bring about that decarbonisation. The will is there, the appetite is there. With the heavy sort of ESG agenda that still lies within financial circles, the investment potential is there. It's all about unlocking that. And as Sean was just describing there, some of these things very often are not necessarily costly. So particularly in terms of the speed of delivery, they're about things like permitting and planning regulations. How quickly can you bring the community along with you to make them feel like they're part of this? Ultimately, however, as we sit today in July 2024, very few, if any, of these sorts of operations would be commercially profitable in their own right as of today. And that is, again, where you need the public finances, the governments around the world to step in and say, actually, we recognize that whilst the carbon price isn't where it probably should be in terms of a real cost of carbon to the planet, society, etc., then we will step in and potentially make up the difference or some of that difference such that you can have an operation that is at least break even, if not slightly profitable, until such time as we get all the other rules and regulations in place so that the carbon price is more realistic and your operations then become profitable in the standalone right. And no business, let's be honest, no business or very few businesses actually want a business that's entirely dependent upon subsidies. This is not businesses calling and clamoring out for subsidies just for the sake of it, because subsidies can be quite fickle. They can change, obviously. So businesses ideally want to get off subsidies as quickly as they can and move to that more profitable model when they can.
I'm just curious. I mean, so you mentioned, so industry has not, you would think sometimes, they'd look at some of these things and go, oh, well, do we have to? But it sounded like that at least maybe in the Humber, and Sean, I don't know about in other places, that, industry seems to be a very willing partner, a very interested partner in moving these things forward. Is that correct? Or
yeah. Well, we see that across the globe in all the clusters. It's really industry that's driving this. It's really industry that has the goals. It's really the industry that can benefit from this collaboration in the long term. So we do see industry as a strong driver. And it's one thing that's really great about being at EPRI is we see a lot of our utility partners at EPRI stepping in, because the utilities can be a great anchor within their region in terms of getting some of these moving. So we do see a lot of that happening too from the industry side.
And I think what's really interesting through the work where you and I sort of first met, Sean, with the World Economic Forum Industrial Cluster Program, I think that's up to something in the region of about 20 or 25 clusters around the world now, and we've seen that level of interest around the world from clusters. Not just coming to the Humber, although I can speak most eloquently about the Humber, but, that kind of knowledge exchange and visits and fact-finding missions that are going on between clusters all around the world. And, we've, in the Humber in particular, we've had delegations and conversations with California, with Houston, with the Netherlands, with South Africa. We've had German delegations, Danish delegations. So this is generally, and not exclusively, governments and government agencies are involved in some of those visits, but very often those are business-led visits as well. So this is business striving to find out how business can go about decarbonizing its operations so they've got a more sustainable future.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'd encourage your listeners to go ahead and Google the World Economic Forum Transitioning Industrial Clusters initiative, and you'll see there's a map-based look at these 21 clusters that are in our network, and lots of great resources there to pull down in terms of all these things we've been talking about, as well as a snapshot of each one of those clusters. So a lot of great resources there to the initiative. Thanks
for sharing that. We will add a link in the to the podcast, and then on the in sort of like the podcast synopsis. Once we're done, and then Jonathan, there's the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan.org seems to be, I think, a good overview for what's going on at Humber.
Given that I was one of the ones leading that piece of work, Bill, I'd say it's an excellent website to visit. Definitely.
Please.
It is a really good website to visit. There's also information available on all of the UK clusters through ukri.org.uk website. So that's UKRI for UK Research and Innovation. And they actually have a report which covers all of the industrial clusters across the UK and sort of provides a bit of a comparison of, what went particularly well during some of those industrial cluster plan projects and what didn't go so well, or where one project had a particular advantage over another, and so on and so forth. So that's another interesting website to visit, and we can put that link in the podcast text as well.
Well, this has certainly been fascinating. Before we close out, anything else that you two would like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, I'd certainly like to add a few things if you can bear with me, Bill. I think
just a few.
You talked a little bit about you and Sean both talked about this being a technical or technology-led audience, and with all due deference, and I'm a technical person too. I'm a chemist, as you described, Bill. But at one level, actually, the work we're talking about here is not necessarily that technically challenging. And that's not because I underestimate the challenge. I do recognize the challenges. But we have been storing gases underground for many years. We have been using CO2. Now, I know sometimes or very often for enhanced oil recovery, we've been pushing CO2 underground too. We know how to scrub gases out of flue gases and such like. We know how to compress gases and move them around. So at one level, much of this technology is not actually that challenging. And again, for the avoidance of doubt, it doesn't mean it can't be continuously worked upon to make it more efficient or cheaper or any of those things. It doesn't mean that at all. But we know how to do it. The challenge actually starts to come when you find out how do you bring the people along with you, because this needs to have some sort of engagement with community stakeholders wherever you're operating. How do you get the right policies in place to, in effect, the rules and regs I talked about? And how do you make it sufficiently profitable? And I don't mean that profitability term in a sort of pejorative sense. This is about sufficiently profitable that companies of whatever persuasion will want to step in and operate here. And one of the things we found really helpful in the Humber, which I briefly mentioned earlier on, was actually drawing out a timeline of things that had happened in the Humber over the last 250 or 300 years. So when we engaged with some of the people in the community and the community leaders and groups and such like, they had this light bulb moment that helped them understand that this wasn't some sort of complete revolution, a lightning bolt from the blue, as it were. This was actually an evolution of 200 to 300 years worth of industrial and commercial history. And it was like, I get it now. I see why this is so important. And it's this continuation that takes us forward into a future world where we do less and less damage to our climate, but still have important, well-paid jobs and produce all the goods and services that people and businesses around the world want.
I'll build on that. I think say a few words about what EPRI is looking at in this space long term. And I think Jonathan, hit this on the nose. This isn't really where we need to look at fundamental research or where we need to. Certainly, there are some technology gaps out there, but there's plenty to be done with today's technologies, with today's knowledge. So EPRI is building a program which is managed by Tracy Leslie, one of my colleagues, which is largely focused on tech transfer. So tech transfer around these technologies that we talked about, carbon capture and clean hydrogen and all that EPRI does in the clean electricity space to make this work. So, but I think one opportunity that we'll see EPRI focus on a little bit more in the future is this idea of the economics. I think, as Jonathan said, I think for this to really go to scale, it has to be economically viable. Industry is not going to be able to invest in large scale carbon reduction programs to put them at a competitive disadvantage. So the more that we can do to think through this ecosystem, and EPRI does some great economic analysis in this space, thinking through not only the hard changes that need to happen at the facility scale, but also upstream. What does it really look like to put in clean carbon infrastructure, clean hydrogen infrastructure, for example? So EPRI is focusing the analysis on those very questions, which I think will be super helpful here.
And you've got to get the right policies surrounding that as well. So, for instance, here in the UK and Europe, we're now in the throes of things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which will help balance that sort of carbon equation either side of a border when you're importing or exporting products. And again, that's all about trying to allow for or account for the fact that we don't have, the carbon price perhaps in the place it needs to be. So, organizations like the CBI and others, we're trying to make sure you don't get any of those unintended consequences, or at least that we minimize the unintended consequences when, the governments bring forward various pieces of legislation and policy.
Guys, thank you so much for this. This is really fascinating. And I think we'll have to have you back for a future episode to continue watching where things are, how things are developing in this area. But again, thank you so much, Sean and Jonathan. I really appreciate it. And thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us for today's episode. If you like what you've seen or heard, please feel free to subscribe. That's it for this episode of EPRI Current. I'm your host again, Bill Florence, and we'll see you again soon. If you like today's show, we invite you to subscribe to our podcast. And feel free to share the podcast with your colleagues and friends. For more information about EPRI, please visit our website at www.epri.com. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at EPRI News. Together, we are shaping the future of energy.